I'm going to introduce the panel as a whole, and then we'll call them up. First, we will have a presentation, however, by Representative Bernie Sanders, who's been introduced before. He's going to take 10 minutes, and in that impossible 10 minutes is going to tell us both what full funding of these covenant promises would be and how to pay for it. I would disagree with the Reverend Jackson only in the sense of his introduction, having said that Representative Sanders is not only seasoned but mellowed. I would agree with the former, but certainly not the latter. And his colleague from the Congress is shaking her head as well. We hope he doesn't mellow. We're counting on his leadership in the Congress, Representative Bernie Sanders.
Let me begin by thanking Jesse Jackson, who has disappeared, I guess, because whenever it seems that the progressive community has got to come together to analyze what's happening and where we should go, it's Jesse Jackson who makes the call. So I think we owe him a debt of gratitude. And I'm also delighted that Secretary Reich was here, and I guess later Secretary Shalala is going to be here. And we have so many people who are coming together today to talk about how we can create a country and how we can create a government which represents all of the people for a change rather than just the rich and the very rich. And it's about time we did that. I think when one recalls the horrors of Reaganomics, the horror is not just the reality of what they have created, but rather it is their refusal to deal with the very difficult and burning issues facing our country. Some of you may remember that in 1984, when the guts of this country were being torn apart, when homelessness was growing, when the health care system was disintegrating, when the standard of living of American workers was declining, when more and more of our children were becoming hungry, when our infrastructure was collapsing, when leveraged buyouts were throwing workers out on the street, that's when we saw those lovely 30-second ads about mourning in America. Remember that? The lights were going out all over the country. The people were suffering, and the ads were telling us mourning in America. Things were getting better. Things were getting worse. And I'm delighted that at least, while I personally will have differences with President Clinton, at least there is now an acknowledgement of the severity of the problems, placing them on the table, and then let's begin to work together to solve them. But we can't solve them unless we acknowledge them. And what we have got to acknowledge is that Reaganomics was one of the great frauds in the history of this country, and we got to overturn it. My job this afternoon is to very briefly suggest some ideas as to how we can raise the necessary funds to do, as President Clinton has said, put people first. In other words, if we all agree that it is a national disgrace that 80 million Americans either have no health insurance or are underinsured, then we've got to figure out how do we solve that problem. If we agree that our infrastructure is falling apart and at exactly the same time we have millions of workers in the building trades area ready to go to work to rebuild America, and yet they're unemployed, then we got to figure out a way to raise the funds so that we can rebuild our infrastructure, put workers back to work at decent wages. If we agree that it is unacceptable that 2 million Americans sleep out on the street, then we've got to figure out how do we raise the money to build the affordable housing to put people into decent housing. How do we raise the money to feed 5 million children who are hungry? How do we raise the money to deal with the environmental crises all over this country which are making our people sick? How do we raise the money to fulfill the president's goal of making sure that every kid in America who wants a college education can afford to get one? That's going to cost us money. How do we do that? and on and on. How do we raise the money to do those things? Let me very briefly throw out some suggestions as how we might do that. Number one, in terms of health care, I have some very good news. And the good news is that you don't need any more money to provide comprehensive, quality health care to every man, woman, and child in this country, because we're already spending much more than we have to spend. We don't need more money, but what do we need? We need political courage to take on the insurance companies and the drug companies and the doctors and to come together and finally establish a single-payer national health care system guaranteeing health care to all people. So in other words, on that issue, there is good news. It does take money to rebuild the infrastructure. But in the area of health care, please understand, we are spending 40% more per capita than the Canadians, double what many European countries are spending on health care, and so many of our people don't have any insurance at all. So what we need there is not, as some have suggested, including people in the Clinton administration, we don't need tens of billions of dollars more. You don't need to raise taxes on workers' health insurance benefits in order to pay for national health care. We could do it now. If we have the guts to do it, let's do it. But for many areas, in fact, we are going to need money to rebuild America, to feed the kids, to provide educational opportunity. Let's talk for a brief moment as to how, in a fair and progressive way, we might raise that money. Now, others have already talked about that. Congresswoman Velasquez, Secretary Reich, but let me briefly go over some facts. During the 1980s, as you all know, while the standard of living of American workers declined, the very richest people became much richer. According to a 1991 study, listen closely to this one, tax cuts for the richest 1 million American families, and that's people whose incomes average a mere $675,000 apiece, low-income families. Those people between 1978 and 1992, they, as a result of the tax cuts that they received, added $1 trillion to the national debt. $1 trillion in tax cuts. The same study found that these same 1 million families, the richest people in America, pay 30% less of their incomes in taxes than they would have had the 1977 tax code remained in existence. So what does that tell us when we look for funding for feeding hungry children, for putting people into affordable housing? It means to me that the time is now, in a very strong way, to say to the wealthiest people in this country, they're going to have to start paying their fair share of taxes. And that means, to my mind, going much higher than raising the income tax rate from 31 to 36%. It means, among other things, we should go higher than that. It means that we must create a progressive corporate tax rate. It means we must be prepared to do away with much of the tax deductibility for business meals and entertainment. Some of our friends who were able to write off going to the country clubs are going to finally start having to look at the hungry children on the sidewalk as they go to the country club and maybe pay a tax on that. And it means doing away with the tax breaks that now exist to help companies acquire runaway plants and move out of the country. And also, I think that the time is right that we even may have to contemplate going beyond just an income tax and talk about a tax on wealth. I think that that's appropriate as well. Secondly, when we talk about how we're going to raise the money that we need, it is absolutely imperative and impossible not to look at the bloated military budget. I think very few people have illusions that the world we're living in now is wonderful, is perfectly safe, that we should disarm America. Nobody thinks that. But on the other hand, there is some excellent news. The fact of the matter is that the Cold War is over. Our longtime adversary, the Soviet Union, does not exist. Russia wants to join NATO. Russia has significantly cut down on their military spending. Walesa is no longer in jail in Poland. He's the president of the country. East Germany is no longer threatening West Germany. It is part of West Germany, and so forth and so on. In my view, and the view of people who know more about this than I do, this country today can very safely reduce military spending by 50% over the next 4 years and use those hundreds of billions of dollars in freed up money to reinvest in America and to deal with the deficit. Let me also touch very briefly, when we talk about how we are going to acquire some money, it's always a funny thing, you know, when we need money for hungry children, when we need money to create productive jobs, they always tell us there's not money available. But you know what? When they wanted a war in the Persian Gulf, no problem, plenty of money available. And let me tell you someplace else where there's always money available. In the next couple of months, unless I'm very mistaken, President, Democrats, Republicans are going to come before the people and say they need another $40 or $50 billion to bail out the savings and loan industry. Another $40 or $50 billion. Now, I happen to think that with all of this talk about the deficit and how we may have to ask senior citizens to take cuts in COLAs and raise middle-income taxes and gas taxes and so forth and so on, everybody is so concerned about the deficit. Why the hell are we dumping another $40 billion into the deficit to bail out the savings and loan industry? Make sense to anybody here? All right. So I think that there are fairer and more progressive ways to deal with the S&L bailout than to dump it into the deficit. Let me simply conclude and pick up a point I think that Nydia Velasquez made earlier, and that is that we now have the potential to make some very fundamental changes in this country. But we cannot do it unless we come together and stand up and fight. 45% of the people don't vote. Poor people don't vote. Many working people don't vote. Our voices are not being heard. The good news is that after 12 years, Reaganomics is gone. But don't anybody think that there is not an enormous struggle in front of us. So my hope is that those of us in Congress, those in the unions, the Women's Committee, all of you, that we all begin to stand together and say that this country has the potential to be the best country that there ever was. And we can do that if we stand together, and let's do that. Thank you very much.